Ethan Harrison had always considered himself a man caught between two worlds: the structured life of the city where he worked as an architect and the untamed quiet of the Colorado mountains where his late father had left him a cabin lot. The property was nothing extravagant, not even a proper house by modern standards, just an aging wooden structure tucked deep into the forest on a piece of land that stretched down to a rocky creek. Yet to Ethan, it was far more than timber and soil. His father had spent his final years escaping there, teaching Ethan to fish in the cold stream and to respect the silence of the woods. When his brother died years earlier during a climbing accident, the cabin became a place where grief and memory fused together. And though Ethan never spoke of it to colleagues or friends, he carried the weight of that loss every time he crossed the threshold of the old cabin. It was, in every sense, a private sanctuary, an anchor that connected him to his family's past and gave him a sense of continuity that his career in the city never could. The land came to Ethan through a difficult process, one that involved more court documents than he cared to recall. His father had never been organized with paperwork, and distant relatives had contested the inheritance, each trying to stake a claim on the modest property. It had taken months of hearings and the persistence of a determined attorney to establish Ethan as the rightful owner. When the judge finally confirmed the decision, he felt relief mixed with an odd responsibility. He did not see the land as an investment or development opportunity, but as something that had to be preserved, both for his own sense of peace and perhaps one day for his young son, who was still too little to understand why his father sometimes vanished into the mountains for long weekends. The cabin was more than wood and stone. It was memory turned physical, a map of his family's story etched into every floorboard and tree trunk surrounding it. On his first return after the court ruling, Ethan walked slowly across the uneven ground, taking in the scent of pine resin and damp earth. The cabin leaned slightly to one side, the porch sagging under years of weather and neglect, but he saw it with the eyes of an architect, not just a son. He imagined how he might restore it, keeping the integrity of the old beams but reinforcing them with discrete modern structures, replacing the rusted roof with something that could withstand the winter snow while still resembling the hand-cut shingles his father had nailed down decades ago. Every crack in the wood and every stone embedded in the soil carried a memory, and the thought of transforming it into a retreat for his own family filled him with a mixture of nostalgia and determination. Life in Denver moved quickly, filled with deadlines, client meetings, and endless revisions to building plans, but the cabin remained a slow, unmoving constant. Ethan often thought of it during late nights in his office when the city's glow poured through the tall windows. In those moments he felt the pull of silence, the need to escape the chatter of voices and the hum of machines. He told himself that one day soon he would spend weeks at a time up there, clearing brush, repairing the foundation, and breathing the air that seemed to reset his lungs. The dream was simple but powerful, a place where his son could grow up knowing the smell of wood smoke and the sound of the creek under winter ice. There was, however, a shadow beneath the dream, a faint unease that Ethan had tried to ignore. The property sat close to a small gated development that had appeared over the past decade, a place filled with vacation homes built by people from out of state who wanted mountain views without the inconvenience of real isolation. Ethan had never cared much about them. He kept his distance, and they seemed content to keep theirs. Yet he noticed the way their fences crept further down the hill each year, how their neatly paved roads inched closer toward the edge of his land. He had dismissed it as normal suburban expansion, something irrelevant to his quiet lot. The cabin, after all, was documented, recorded in county maps that stretched back long before the development existed. It was safe, or so he believed. As autumn settled and the aspen leaves turned to gold, Ethan felt more resolved than ever to begin serious work on the restoration. He bought tools, ordered supplies, and made sketches of how he would modernize the cabin without erasing its soul. He told his colleagues he would be less available on weekends, and he explained to his son that they would soon have a place in the mountains that belonged only to them. For the first time in years, he felt aligned with his past and his future, grounded in the certainty that the cabin would endure. He could not have imagined, standing in the crisp air that season, that forces he had never considered would soon come forward claiming that his sanctuary was not his at all, and that his fight to protect the land would lead him far beyond property. Disputes, and into the shadowy world of hidden accounts and fraudulent power. The letter arrived on a gray morning that seemed unremarkable in every other way. Ethan had driven up to the cabin lot to check on the roof before the first real snowfall, planning nothing more than a quiet day of measuring, sketching, and clearing fallen branches. The envelope was tucked into the old metal mailbox at the edge of the dirt road, its surface smeared with rain as though it had been left there for several days. At first glance, it looked like junk mail, thick paper with a polished logo in the corner. He almost tossed it aside, but something in the embossed lettering caught his attention, and he tore it open as he walked up the path toward the cabin. The words inside stopped him mid-step, forcing him to read and reread until the meaning settled heavily in his chest. The document claimed to be an official notice from the Mountain Pine Homeowners Association, a name Ethan recognized vaguely as the organization that governed the cluster of new houses half a mile away. The letter stated, in firm and legalistic language, that his cabin lot fell under the jurisdiction of their association, and that, as a result of non-payment of dues, his property had been flagged for lien and potential auction. The sum listed was absurd, a few $1,000s allegedly accumulated over the past 3 years, despite the fact that he had never received a single bill, reminder, or notice until this one. The signature at the bottom belonged to someone named Mark Rivers, identified as president of the HOA, and it was accompanied by a notary seal that seemed strangely unfamiliar, the lines blurred, and the date of commission already expired. For several long minutes, Ethan simply stood in the yard, the letter trembling in his hand as the wind tugged at the corners of the paper. His first instinct was disbelief, the natural assumption that this was some bureaucratic mistake that could be resolved with a phone call. His land had been confirmed by a court, his title clear, his taxes paid directly to the county. He had no agreement with any association, no contract or covenant tying him to the Mountain Pine development, and no logical reason why they should have any claim over his lot. Yet the language of the letter was confident and deliberate, as though the matter was already settled and he had no choice but to comply. The phrase that struck him most sharply was written in bold near the top. Failure to remit payment within 30 days will result in foreclosure, proceedings as authorized by state law and the bylaws of the association. He sat on the steps of the cabin for nearly an hour staring at the paper, his mind shifting between confusion and anger. The absurdity of it burned in his chest. How could a group of people he had never met, whose homes had been built decades after his family first claimed this land, simply decide that it belonged to them? He remembered the sagging porch where his father once strung a line of trout, the cracked window his brother had broken with a baseball when they were teenagers, the narrow trail down to the creek they had cleared by hand. None of that could be erased by a stamp on paper. Yet, as he thought of the bureaucratic machinery implied in the notice, lawyers, liens, and auctions, he realized with a chill that if they had already filed claims with the county, the weight of the system could turn falsehood into reality. Determined to verify the situation before confronting anyone, Ethan drove back into town and went directly to the county clerk's office. The building smelled faintly of dust and toner, its fluorescent lights buzzing as he explained his concern to a clerk behind the counter. She was polite but matter-of-fact, tapping at her keyboard as he handed her the letter. Within minutes her expression shifted, not into sympathy but into the distant neutrality of someone who had seen such cases before. "There is a lien filed on this parcel," she said, turning the screen slightly as though to confirm the record with him. The name of the claimant was indeed Mountain Pine Homeowners Association, and the filing date was nearly 2 years earlier, just months after the court had confirmed his inheritance. "If you believe it's an error, you'll need to dispute it through proper channels," she added, her voice flat as though reading from an invisible script. Ethan pressed her for details, asking how an association could claim land never developed under their authority, but the clerk only shrugged. "They filed the paperwork, and until a judge says otherwise, it stands. You can hire an attorney to contest it, but be aware, foreclosure can proceed if dues remain unpaid." Her words felt like a dismissal, leaving him standing at the counter with the sudden weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. He requested copies of the filings, and when the printer spat out page after page of stamped forms, he scanned them quickly, noting the glaring inconsistencies. The notary's signature was the same one from his letter, still expired, and the description of his property boundaries was vague, relying on outdated maps rather than the certified survey he had used in court. It looked amateurish, even sloppy, yet it carried the force of official registration. Driving back to the cabin, Ethan's anger sharpened into resolve. This was no innocent mistake of bureaucracy. Someone had deliberately targeted his lot, filing fraudulent documents with enough confidence to assume he would not challenge them. He imagined the board members of the HOA sitting in their polished meeting room, convinced that a solitary cabin owner without deep pockets would be an easy victim. The thought of it twisted his stomach. He had worked too hard, endured too much to secure this land, to allow it to be stolen by strangers wielding stamps and seals. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the clearing, Ethan had made a decision. He would confront this head-on, not with anger alone, but with evidence, persistence, and whatever strength it required. The letter that had arrived so quietly in his mailbox was not simply a demand for money. It was the opening shot in a battle for his family's legacy. What unsettled him most was not the threat of foreclosure, but the realization that the people behind this had done it before. The confidence of their language, the casual use of forged seals, the brazenness of claiming land they knew was not theirs. It all pointed to a system, a machine that had swallowed others before him. He could not shake the feeling that his fight was only beginning, and that the true extent of what lay beneath the surface would be far darker than a simple debt collection. Ethan drove to the HOA office the following week with the stack of documents from the county clutched tightly in his bag, every page marked with notes he had made during sleepless nights at the cabin. The building was not imposing, just a beige structure in a small commercial strip that smelled faintly of detergent and old carpet. But as soon as he stepped through the glass door, he felt the sterile weight of controlled space. The receptionist, a woman in her 40s with glasses that magnified her eyes, glanced at him without warmth when he introduced himself and explained why he had come. She barely concealed her irritation as she asked if he had an appointment, and when he said no, she disappeared into the back room with a perfunctory "wait here" that made him feel like an intruder. Ethan stood in the quiet lobby under the humming light fixtures, staring at the wall covered with framed photos of smiling residents at picnics and pool parties, a curated version of community that seemed to mock his presence. When the door opened again, a tall man in a dark suit walked toward him with the slow, deliberate confidence of someone who never doubted his authority. He introduced himself as Mark Rivers, the HOA president, his handshake firm but cold, his eyes calculating. Without preamble, he led Ethan into a small conference room furnished with nothing but a polished table and 2 chairs, and after sitting down he folded his hands, waiting with an expression that hovered between boredom and challenge. Ethan laid the documents on the table, explaining carefully that the lien was fraudulent, the notary seal expired, the maps inaccurate, and the claim itself baseless since his property had never been part of the association. He spoke with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed his words 100 times, but as he spoke, Mark's expression never changed. He listened without interruption, occasionally glancing at the papers, but his stillness carried a weight that felt deliberately dismissive. When Ethan finished, Mark leaned back in his chair and tapped a pen against the table with infuriating slowness. "Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice smooth and slightly condescending. "I understand your frustration, but you're mistaken. Our revised bylaws clearly place all properties within the designated radius under the jurisdiction of Mountain Pine Association. Opt-outs or exemptions that may have existed in the past no longer apply. Your father's cabin lot falls within our boundaries, and therefore our claims are valid. The lien is legitimate, and if dues remain unpaid, foreclosure is inevitable." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He explained again that his title had been confirmed in court, that his surveys were up to date, that the association had no legal standing to redraw boundaries at will. But Mark's calm smile never faltered. He spoke in the measured tones of someone accustomed to outlasting objections, someone who knew how to wield the vagueness of rules as a weapon. "If you are dissatisfied," he said finally, "you are welcome to pursue legal counsel. But I assure you, everything we have done is within the scope of our rights as outlined in state statute and our governing documents." The words were delivered with such certainty that for a moment Ethan felt himself questioning his own position. Despite the clear evidence in front of him, it was not logic that Rivers relied on, but confidence, the sheer audacity of power projected through a polished voice and a steady gaze. Ethan gathered his papers with stiff movements, resisting the urge to shout, to accuse him of forgery and fraud, knowing that anger would only feed the man's satisfaction. As he stood to leave, Rivers added almost casually, "It would be wise to resolve this quickly." Auction dates move fast once the process begins, and investors don't like delays. The phrase landed like a stone in Ethan's stomach, a subtle confirmation that this was not about unpaid dues or neighborhood unity, but about profit. Investors were already in line, waiting like vultures for the property to be stripped from him. He walked out of the office into the cold air, his hands trembling not with fear, but with the raw surge of rage. For years he had designed buildings in cities where deals were made in polished boardrooms, but he had never faced corruption so naked, so brazen. These were not men who hid behind complex contracts or endless negotiations. They were opportunists cloaked in the thin fabric of community authority, taking what they wanted from those who lacked the resources to fight back. The next days brought no relief. More letters arrived in his mailbox at the cabin, each one firmer than the last, citing additional fees for administrative processing and late payment, the numbers climbing as though pulled from the air. Neighbors from the development began to glance at him strangely when he passed their driveways, their expressions guarded, as if they had already been told a version of the story that painted him as the obstinate outsider refusing to follow the rules. One evening he returned to find a notice nailed directly to the cabin door, its heavy staples puncturing the wood his father once sanded smooth. The paper declared the property in violation of community standards and ordered immediate remediation. He tore it down with shaking hands, staring at the punctures left in the wood as though they were wounds. The escalation was no longer abstract, no longer confined to documents and offices. It was physical, invasive, and deliberate, designed to break him down. Ethan understood then that this was not a simple fight over property lines. It was a campaign, a strategy crafted to wear him into submission. They counted on his isolation, on the difficulty of mounting a legal defense, on the fear that came with seeing one's home slowly redefined as someone else's possession. What they had not counted on was his resolve, sharpened by grief and anchored by memory. As he sat on the porch that night, the letter crumpled in his fist, he knew with a clarity that chilled him that the fight had only begun, and he would not walk away. Ethan had always trusted the clarity of records more than the persuasion of people, which was why, after the exhausting confrontation with Mark Rivers and the sickening realization that the HOA was willing to fabricate authority out of thin air, he turned to the only place he thought could provide indisputable truth: the archives. He drove 2 hours to the county seat, a place that smelled of stale coffee and paper that had been stored too long, and requested access to every deed, map, and survey related to his property and the surrounding developments. The clerk looked at him with the weary expression of someone who had processed too many anxious landowners and reluctantly wheeled out a cart stacked with dusty folders and microfilm reels. Ethan spread the records across a long table, his notes beside him, and began the meticulous work of tracing boundaries and verifying histories. What he found both unsettled and intrigued him. The original survey maps of his land dated back more than half a century, clearly identifying the parcel as an independent lot outside the jurisdiction of any subdivision or association. These maps were unambiguous, drawn by licensed surveyors, signed, sealed, and stored in official county records. Later maps, however, began to show subtle encroachments, faint lines redrawn to suggest overlapping jurisdictions. By the time the Mountain Pine development was constructed, the HOA's maps claimed not only the lots of its newly built houses, but also swaths of adjacent forest land, including Ethan's cabin lot. None of this had ever been formally approved, but the lines were presented in glossy pamphlets and community planning documents as though they were fact. Ethan realized with a chill that the HOA had been slowly, quietly expanding its imaginary borders until residents and even local officials simply accepted them as truth. Determined to push further, he filed a public request for the association's financial disclosures, which by law they were supposed to provide to the county annually. What he received was a slim folder with balance sheets that seemed too neat, too perfectly arranged, numbers that suggested a steady income of dues and a modest set of expenses for landscaping, maintenance, and community events. Yet, as he read through them, something felt wrong. The totals were rounded in ways that real budgets rarely were, as if they had been cleaned for display. The names of contractors were generic, entities he could not trace in any registry of licensed businesses. The more he looked, the more convinced he became that these documents were designed not to reveal, but to obscure. On a hunch, Ethan drove to a small rural bank listed as the custodian of the HOA's accounts, a squat brick building that looked forgotten by time. He entered under the pretense of inquiring about setting up an account for restoration funds for his cabin, but while waiting for the manager, his eyes scanned the plaques and certificates on the walls. You'd see the bank had been chartered decades earlier but seemed to operate with almost no visible staff, just 2 tellers and 1 elderly manager who greeted him politely. When Ethan casually mentioned Mountain Pine Association, the manager's expression flickered for an instant before smoothing back into professional neutrality. "They are one of our long-standing clients," he said, almost too quickly before excusing himself to retrieve brochures. That small slip told Ethan more than he expected. The HOA's financial dealings were not only routed through this obscure bank, but likely protected there, sheltered from scrutiny in ways that larger institutions would not permit. Later that evening, back at the cabin, Ethan reviewed his notes under the dim glow of a lantern. He pieced together a pattern that felt like the edges of a larger design. The HOA was not just inflating boundaries to claim his land. They were funneling money through a closed system, collecting dues, fines, and foreclosure proceeds, then cycling them into accounts that had little oversight. It explained the confidence with which Rivers had spoken, the casual mention of investors already waiting for auctioned properties, the dismissive certainty that Ethan could not win. This was not a simple matter of a greedy board. It was a machine built to generate money by turning homeowners into debtors and debtors into dispossessed sellers. And now they had set their eyes on him. His discovery should have felt like progress, but instead it carried a deeper weight. If what he suspected was true, then he was no longer fighting just to save his cabin. He was standing in the path of a system designed to consume people like him, people without armies of lawyers or vast sums of cash to fight back. The HOA had weaponized bureaucracy, transforming it into a kind of slow violence that stripped away ownership and dignity with equal precision. Ethan understood that he could not fight them in the same way they operated. He needed to find a different leverage, something that reached beyond the narrow world of bylaws and liens. As he sat in the silent cabin, the creek rushing faintly in the distance, his mind turned to the one entity powerful enough to unravel financial deceit, the Internal Revenue Service. The thought came almost by accident, triggered by a memory of a friend who once faced ruin over a minor discrepancy in tax filings. If the IRS could dismantle ordinary citizens over a few $100s in reporting errors, what would they do if they uncovered a homeowners association laundering thousands through fraudulent banks? Ethan leaned back, the pieces clicking together in his mind. The fraudulent notary seals, the fabricated maps, the suspicious bank accounts, it all pointed to more than simple greed. It pointed to tax evasion, to organized financial manipulation hidden under the veneer of neighborhood governance. He felt the first flicker of something resembling hope. Perhaps his fight was not hopeless after all. That night, however, his hope was tempered by unease. When he stepped outside to breathe in the cold mountain air, he noticed tracks in the dirt near his cabin's door, fresh tire marks that had not been there in the morning. Someone had driven close, perhaps even stepped out, though nothing seemed taken or disturbed. On the porch railing he found a small slip of paper, folded once and tucked neatly under a rock. He opened it to find no words, just a photocopy of his property deed with a large red X drawn across it. The message was clear. They knew what he was doing, and they wanted him to feel watched. Ethan stood in the darkness with the paper in his hand, his anger now sharpened into something colder. They wanted him to be afraid, to back down, to believe that resistance was futile. But all they had accomplished was to confirm that he was over the target. When he returned inside, he pinned the note to the wall above his desk next to the maps and bank records he had begun collecting. It would serve as both warning and motivation. The HOA had escalated from paperwork to intimidation, but he was ready to respond not with fear, but with strategy. He knew now that this battle was not going to be won quickly or easily, but for the first time he saw a path forward. If the IRS could be made to see what he saw, the weight of their authority might finally tip the scale. And as he stared at the documents spread before him, the outline of a larger, more dangerous truth began to take shape, a truth that would change his fight from a personal struggle into something much larger than himself. The warning left on his porch did not remain an isolated gesture. Within days, the pressure around Ethan began to mount in ways that were subtle enough to pass as coincidence, yet pointed enough to feel orchestrated. When he returned to the cabin after a brief trip into town, he found a heavy chain padlocked around the front gate of his access road, the kind of chain used to block construction sites, with no sign of who had placed it. A notice flapped against the metal in the wind, printed on the same cream paper as the previous letters, accusing him of unauthorized occupancy and demanding that he vacate the premises until compliance issues were resolved. Ethan cut the chain with bolt cutters borrowed from a neighbor, the cold air stinging his hands as he worked, but the violation of seeing his property physically claimed by others left him seething. It was no longer a matter of paperwork in a file. It was intrusion made visible, tangible, designed to humiliate him into submission. The next morning, he drove into the development to confront the HOA office again, but this time the receptionist refused to let him pass the lobby. She handed him a folder with yet another series of fines, now for environmental hazards, supposedly created by his cabin's waste system, an accusation so absurd he nearly laughed in her face. Yet when he scanned the papers, he saw that they bore official county letterheads, carefully forged copies of real documents altered just enough to justify penalties. The precision of the deception unsettled him. These were not amateurs throwing empty threats. Someone had the skill and audacity to counterfeit government paperwork, and they expected him to swallow it as fact. When he asked to see Rivers, the receptionist shook her head curtly and suggested he retain counsel if he wished to dispute the charges. Her dismissal was absolute, and as he left the building, he felt the eyes of residents following him from behind curtains, their whispers trailing like smoke. The narrative was shifting, and he was becoming the villain in their story. That evening, Ethan discovered something far more invasive. As he sorted through his personal files at the cabin, he noticed that a folder he kept locked in a metal box had been disturbed. The latch bore scratches as if forced open, and inside the neatly arranged papers he found a photocopy of his tax return, an item he had never kept in that box. It was as if someone had broken in, planted evidence of their access, and left again, confident he would find it. The realization chilled him. They were not simply attacking his ownership of the land. They were reaching into the core of his personal identity, collecting documents that could be twisted against him, proof that they had resources far beyond neighborhood squabbles. He burned the photocopy in the fireplace, watching the edges curl into black ash, and understood that the fight had crossed a line. Though he feared escalation, Ethan refused to retreat. Instead, he began documenting every incident with meticulous care, compiling photos of the chain, the forged notices, the tampered files. He spoke little to those around him, but quietly he prepared, organizing the evidence in chronological order, labeling each piece with dates and descriptions. He no longer trusted that local authorities would intervene. Too many times he had seen officials shrug off complaints against the HOA, and he suspected the association had already cultivated allies within the county. His hope rested increasingly on the larger investigation he had initiated. The quiet packet of documents he had already mailed to the IRS office marked confidential and urgent. But the HOA did not relent. One night he woke to the crunch of gravel outside and the faint glow of the headlights retreating down the road. When he stepped outside with a flashlight, he found his porch littered with glossy pamphlets advertising investment opportunities for newly available mountain properties. The implication was unmistakable. They had already begun marketing his cabin lot as if it were theirs to sell, confident that the foreclosure process would soon clear the way. The sheer arrogance of it made his stomach twist. He gathered the papers and stuffed them into a folder, each one more evidence of their premeditated theft, but the thought of strangers casually eyeing his land as a commodity filled him with a slow, burning rage. The harassment grew bolder. On a cold Friday afternoon, as he returned from town with supplies, he found two men standing near the edge of his property, dressed in business casual clothes, clipboards in hand. They claimed to be inspectors sent to assess code compliance, though when Ethan asked for identification, they simply smirked and said they were authorized by the HOA. Their presence felt less like inspection than intimidation, a reminder that the association could send its proxies at will. Ethan ordered them to leave, his voice steady despite the heat rising in his chest, and when they lingered too long, he reached for his phone as if to call the sheriff. Only then did they retreat, their laughter carrying down the road as they left. That night, Ethan sat in the cabin surrounded by his notes, the fire casting long shadows on the walls. The fear that they might return gnawed at him, but beneath it pulsed something stronger: determination. Every act of intimidation only convinced him further that they had something to hide, and the bank records he had unearthed were just the beginning. He no longer saw himself as the passive victim of a fraudulent lien. He was the witness to a crime, and his responsibility was not only to defend his land but to expose the machinery behind its theft. He knew the risks, knew that pressing further could bring more personal danger, but the alternative, surrender, was impossible. He poured himself a cup of coffee, laid out the forged documents, and whispered into the silence of the cabin, a vow to the empty room. If they want to play this game, I'll take it all the way. They think I'm alone, but they're wrong. The IRS will listen. Someone will listen. The storm finally broke not with warning, but with the sudden arrival of black sedans at the entrance to the Mountain Pine community on a morning that seemed otherwise ordinary. Ethan had been at the cabin, reviewing once more the growing stack of evidence he had collected, when his phone buzzed with a message from the IRS contact he had dared to hope would take him seriously. The message was short and without explanation. "Stay nearby." Today, his pulse hammered as he set the phone down, the meaning settling in slowly. For months, he had lived in the shadow of harassment, threats, forged documents, and humiliating notices. But now, something was shifting, the weight of the struggle tilting toward a reckoning. He drove cautiously toward the HOA office, parking his truck at a distance, and watched from the lot of a closed cafe as the scene unfolded. Federal agents stepped from their cars with the unhurried precision of people who knew their authority was absolute. They entered the beige office building without hesitation, past a startled receptionist who rose to protest but was silenced by the flash of credentials. Ethan saw Rivers himself through the window, rising from his chair with a look of disbelief that quickly curdled into outrage. For years he had presided over meetings with smug certainty, issuing fines and decrees like a small-town monarch, but now that control was stripped away. The agents moved with quiet efficiency, producing warrants, demanding access to computers, seizing files from cabinets. The room that had once dismissed Ethan as a nuisance now buzzed with a chaos that felt like vindication. Ethan forced himself to remain still, resisting the urge to step inside. He knew this was no longer his battle to fight directly. It was in the hands of a system larger than the HOA's forged maps and counterfeit seals. Still, he could see everything. The shock on the faces of board members as their records were boxed up, the panic of one man who tried to slip out the back only to be intercepted, the way Rivers' voice rose in protest but cracked when confronted with spreadsheets and bank statements laid out on the table. The IRS had not come lightly. They had uncovered the hidden accounts, the shell contractors, the flows of money disguised as community dues. Ethan could almost hear the silence that followed when the agents revealed that the bank itself had cooperated, handing over years of suspicious transactions. Hours later, when the agents emerged with boxes stacked in their arms and Rivers in their custody, the neighborhood stood in stunned silence. Residents who had once avoided Ethan's gaze now gathered in small groups, whispering with unease, realizing that the authority they had trusted was nothing more than a cover for theft. Ethan remained at a distance, his truck engine idling, but when Rivers was led outside in handcuffs, their eyes met across the parking lot. For the first time, the man who had spoken to him with such casual condescension looked unsettled, his composure cracked. It was not rage that Ethan felt then, but a hollow kind of justice, the sense that something had finally broken free from the endless cycle of intimidation. By the time evening fell, the office was sealed, its doors locked and taped with official notices. The association that had loomed like an immovable wall was suddenly fragile, exposed, collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. Ethan returned to the cabin, the forest quiet around him, and sat on the porch where so many nights he had stared into the dark, wondering if the fight would ever end. He felt exhaustion deep in his bones, but also a release, a long exhale he had been holding for months. He knew this was not the end. The legal process would drag on, investors would try to salvage what they could, and whispers would linger. But the balance of power had shifted. His land was safe for now, not because he had begged or paid, but because he had forced the truth into the open. He closed his eyes and listened to the creek running below, the steady sound unbroken by human interference, and for the first time he allowed himself to believe that the cabin might endure beyond this storm. The battle had reached its peak and shattered, and though the pieces would take time to settle, he no longer felt alone against the machine. Weeks passed before the quiet returned to the mountains, and when it did, Ethan felt it not as a sudden relief but as a gradual loosening, like the uncoiling of a knot that had held him too tightly. The HOA office remained shuttered, its sign removed, its name now spoken only with bitterness among the residents who had once repeated it with deference. Some of them came to Ethan, hesitant at first, to admit that they too had questioned the endless fines and unexplained fees but had been too afraid or too weary to resist. They thanked him, though he did not feel like a hero, only a man who had refused to surrender what was his. The cabin stood as it always had, weathered but resilient, and when he walked through its rooms he felt a deeper connection, as though the walls themselves had endured the trial with him. One evening he brought his young son to the creek, watching the boy skip stones across the surface just as he had once done with his father. The air was sharp and cool, and for the first time in many months, Ethan allowed himself to smile without reservation. He knew the battle had cost him time, sleep, and the sense of ease he once associated with this place, but it had also given him clarity. The cabin was no longer only a relic of family memory. It was a testament to persistence, a reminder that silence in the face of theft was not peace but surrender. He carried the lesson heavily but with pride, knowing that when his son grew older he would understand the value of holding ground, both literal and personal. Yet even in that peace, Ethan did not delude himself into believing the story was over. He had seen too much to trust fully in the permanence of justice. The agents had taken Rivers away, but others would step into the vacuum, and greed had a way of resurfacing in new forms. Still, the cabin remained, his deed unchallenged, his land secured for now, and that was enough. As the boy's laughter echoed against the trees and the last of the sun dipped behind the ridge, Ethan felt the simple truth of survival. The land was his, not by permission of a board or the tolerance of neighbors, but by right and by will, and as long as he drew breath, no paper, no seal, no counterfeit authority would strip it away again.